I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm David Lipsky, and we're on the Concavity Show.
All right. David Lipsky, episode 74, everybody. David, I feel like this is 8 years overdue, and I don't know why it's taken us this long to get to sit down with you on our end, but it's wonderful to finally have you on the show. Obviously, people who know Wallace will know you very well. You, of course, are the author of Although, of course, you end up becoming yourself, which we've talked about a lot on this show over the years. And then it was adapted into a movie called The End of the Tour, and you were played by Jesse Eisenberg, and Jason Segel played Wallace. And that was episode 2. We talked about that movie, Matt, and our thoughts about it, because we got the privilege of seeing it as like a pre-release at a Wallace conference in 2015. So, Dave, it's amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate what you were saying. I just, I thought I would be patient. It wasn't my place to rush you guys. I would send you guys pictures of myself sometimes and cards. I'm sure you guys got all the letters.
I didn't get any of those. Matt was holding out on me.
Invitation must have got lost in the mail.
I would always be like, when are we going to get Lipsky? And Matt's like, oh yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I don't want to bug him yet. I know he's busy right now. We'll get him eventually. And it just like...
I said he's working on this book. As soon as he finishes this book. That was like 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. But I didn't realize you were being that polite. I would just go down to the end of the dock and I would look at the green lights that represented your show and I would reach my hand out to them. Apparently one of my neighbors has been noticing that and has put it in an elegiac short novel about the dreams and failures of the American system.
Does he live out on Long Island?
Yeah. Just before. It's just the fort right before you get to the
Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, so Dave kind of did your formal intro there, but there's actually a lot more to the story. And for people who maybe only know you through the Wallace connection, might not, we're going to get to how you ended up writing this book, The Parrot and the Igloo. But, when I first met you, I think I started reading The Art Fair. And The Art Fair is your first novel, which is sort of autobiographical. Is that fair to say in some ways? Which is about growing up in the art world. And for people who don't know, your mom is a very talented and famous artist.
Your dad's a painter, is that right?
And no, his mom. Okay. And his dad worked in advertising.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah.
That's right.
And his mom...
My dad wrote, Dave, a song called the Pepsi Generation Song, I think. And the lyrics are feeling free. And what it meant was feeling free to abandon his wife and 2 small children.
Shit.
Yeah.
Not to get too personal.
Jeez, okay, that's not to put too fine a point on it, but
yeah, right.
It's very Updikean type rabbit run, you mean? But anyways, David was a writer going back into his undergraduate years, and I wanted to point out one story, which was that when he was an undergraduate, he published a story in the New Yorker called $3,000, which was later selected by Raymond Carver as one of the best American short stories in 1986. And this is like saying, I was trying to think of the right analogy for this, David. This is like a high schooler being drafted by the New York Yankees and starting in the World Series.
Yeah.
And it's like happened maybe once or twice in history, but like I don't know of another, like it's such a legendary story of like another undergrad who's published a story in the New Yorker. Like it's probably impossible in these days, would you say? Like, did you appreciate that at the time?
I was really excited, but it was just more like, since you were mentioning Updike, a writer he really liked was someone named John Barth, who, as you know, Wallace. Sure. And Barth said that one thing that seems to attract people to writing is a passionate lack of alternatives. And I just really had wanted to be a writer from when I was very, very young. And so since my father had followed the advice of his caffeinated beverage advertisement, I knew that I had to start publishing while I was in college or grad school at the latest. So it was exciting, but it was more like, okay, maybe this is going to work, because I'm sure you guys have had friends who graduated from school and they could kind of get their parents to pay for some housing or they could get internships. For mine, it was just, okay, if you can't get started pretty early, you're not going to be able to do this thing that you really love.
Yeah, I think that's something that's been on my mind lately. As you know, obviously, I'm not in my 20s anymore, and I'm
Obviously.
in my late 40s. Looking at people who are in their 20s who are so ambitious, and have this sort of, it's such a different perspective looking back at them now. Like you have younger students. I assume that you're teaching kids in their 20s basically, and no one has a linear path to success, right? Like we could go through and name all of these different stories of people who were successful, but the ones that stand out are the ones that it's like published in the New Yorker when I was 22, but had a best-selling book right out of the gate. That's not the path for most people. So
no, and I'm sorry, Matt, whenever you and I talk, I think we both get too excited because it's just it's one of the weird things. That's why I think a lot of us read books and why we listen to podcasts like this is that there aren't that many people that we can talk to comfortably or excitingly. And so when you have that great good fortune, it can sometimes be a misfortune for the talk because you're just like, wow, this is the kind of talk that I kind of wanted to have. So, but
and we can edit all this out later.
I love. One of the things that I loved about doing the Wallace book, the way I did, and I remember I was reading a review of the Parrot book, and it was a very positive, blush-making review of this book, the climate book, which Matt is quite right. I spent a large amount of time on, and they were saying that I was too nice to David Wallace in a sickly appreciation of an overpraised writer or something like that. And I remember thinking, like, you may not like David Wallace, but there's very little writing by me in that book. That was the whole point of it.
Right. Yeah. It's just a transcript, essentially.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. It's just like, I want you to know what this guy is like.
Yeah.
But I think a lot about what you were saying about linear path to getting good stuff done. And I think about Wallace's path, which is so interesting because Wallace himself, when we were driving around talking. So, Dave, how far into the broadcast or how far into the podcast are we now? Do you have a counter on it?
Like a time?
7 minutes. 7 minutes.
That's as long as I could wait before I told you.
Please do. Please do.
Let's just get that out of the way. But we wanted to hit that hard.
But it's a great thing, which is just that the way he ended up doing his best work is when he couldn't stage manage his life. And Barth, who he and I, Wallace, David and I were both great fans of, Barth had this great thing, and for anybody who is trying to decide how to be a writer or how to be a filmmaker or how to be a musician, and you're also kind of basing it on the examples of people whose work you've liked, Barth said this great thing about it. He said, it's a very confused mariner indeed that confuses the stars he or she steers by for their destination. Because you can try to copy what other people have done, or like, okay, by the time he was 30, Wallace had a bestseller published in paperback, Broom of the System, and then he had a collection of stories. So that's what I need to have done by the time I was 30. But his best work comes from something he can't control, which is he ends up at, the real life equivalent of Edit House, and that gives him an amazing subject. And so, yeah, I love what Matt was saying, which is that you can't really control those things. Like the story that first story that Matt was talking about, was also pretty autobiographical, which is just I had gotten myself in hot water and wrote the story as a way to get out of it, really. And
that obviously we're going to talk a fair amount of Wallace here. We are going to get to your book, but I do have, it's been a while since you and I have gotten to talk about this kind of stuff. And so one thing I was thinking in preparing for today was, I feel some kinship with you in that with both of us, when you Google our names, both of us, another guy's name comes up, which is David Foster Wallace. And like, for better or for worse, you're sort of wedded to his legacy now. And I sort of like, how do you feel about that connection, that your sort of legacy is attached to his legacy in some way?
How do you feel about it, Matt?
I feel like it's like the Catholic Church or something. Like there's no getting out, man. They got you. It's like I can't change it even if I wanted to. No. And like I guess you make peace with that or you don't. And like I've obviously made peace with that. And Wallace had some quote in a Wall Street Journal when Broom of the System came out, everyone's comparing it to Pension, and he was like kind of like a child sticking his thumb out, right? Like I feel that he wanted to be thought of not as the next Pension, but as his own self. So I guess I'm fine with it. How are you?
I sometimes feel lucky, and that there was a wonderful cultural thing happening. And Matt, if there's something great happening with books, with reading and writing, and it was happening during the time that fate picked for you to spend your allotted 20 to 80 on the planet, it's nice to have been a part of it, right? I mean, where else would you rather have not been a part of it? So no, I'm thrilled. And I also, one of the reasons that I did the book was that my producer at NPR said, if you don't, because I'd been talking / bragging about how great it was to spend time. You know this stuff because you and I have talked about this, but I've been talking and bragging about how much fun it was to drive around the Midwest with David. And then he died, and they called me up and they said, do you want to do an appreciation on All Things Considered? And I didn't want to because, Dave and Matt, I'm sure you guys have very clear memory of those days. I got a call from one of my best friends from the Army who said this great thing to me that night, which is he was at orientation at Stanford Law. So it's a pretty big, achievement to be going to Stanford Law. And he said that he'd always somehow assumed that he was going to meet Wallace, which is one of those childish things that we believe that we don't examine, that he had thought that he would meet Wallace and that he would tell him things that he had never told me, for example, about his experience in combat in Iraq, and that Wallace would tell him the thing that would help him understand it. And so what he was coming to grips with was that even though that was a childish fantasy, it was now it was a childish fantasy that he had no way to maintain at all any longer. And so that was kind of the mood that I was in and that most people I knew were in. And I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to read his stuff. I remember I started reading the piece about prescriptive and non-prescriptive grammar again, because it's such an informal, cool piece. And then my producer, a woman named Ellen Silva, said that if I didn't do the piece, everyone would think that he was always a gray-spirited writer. Someone marked for death is a phrase that Hemingway uses about a writer in Movable Feast. And so if I loved his work, it was my duty to share that he was an incredibly cool, charming person. So I felt great doing that on NPR. Rolling Stone then, who I'd already turned down, they had asked me to write about, and I'd said no a few days before. They said, hey, we just heard you on the radio. So you have
wow.
And
And then after I spoke to his family, we came up with this as something that everyone would be comfortable with, and it seemed to me the best way to do it, which is he seems very uncomfortable about someone presenting his life. Here's just what he's like. So I got to do that. What a pleasure. Do you know what I mean? So it causes certain sorts of problems, because if you don't like Wallace, I guess you don't like me.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens with, I'm sort of a stand-in for the default, like, David Foster Wallace fan, lit bro guy, right? Like, they just, there's like a picture of me next to that. But, I also brought this up because his mom is thanked in the book, as is his sister. And, it was really through you that I got to meet his mom that time in Austin.
No, that's great.
And, both his parents are gone now. It's sort of a sad coda, and also a testament to like how long you've been working on the book that she's ended up thanked in the book. But like, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, yeah. I mean, clearly you became good friends with her enough to, send her your work.
Oh yeah. Sally was great. So, Sally and Mrs. Wallace, Sally Wallace, her memorial was last year, around September of last year. Mm-hmm. And I think she had passed a year earlier. So she just passed. But yeah, she was charming and, very strong, and extremely intelligent and funny in the ways that David was intelligent and funny. And so she just asked me what I was working on, and I told her what I was working on, and she said I would love to read it. And then she started editing it, and she was great. The first half of the book is edited by Sally, and it's a great edit. When you turn in a book to a regular, to a publisher, they will want to they'll want to help you with the phrasing. But that's Sally's. The first half of the book is Sally's edit, and just what you do with any edit, like some of her grammar, as you might imagine, was tight as the tightest drum. Like a drum where if you dropped a paper clip, it would be like a timpanium. That's just how tight the drum is.
Right.
And so some of the grammar, I went with the slang, but no, that's her edit, right up until the denier section. So,
did you come in contact with his family before he passed away, or only after?
I had gotten to know them when I was researching the piece for Rolling Stone, and they remembered me from the conversations then.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
But I knew them obviously way better after David died.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted, this is a good little transition to the book, because you mentioned up to the denier section, and, for people, this book just came out in the past month, past a few weeks ago, I guess was the official pub date. And so I don't know how many people have had the chance to read it yet, but you make a comment at the beginning of the book that it's sort of structured like a Netflix series. And I really love that. And as I was reading it, I sort of felt like I was dipping into a new episode, right? That it's like a new chapter here. And so when you get to one of those big breaks, like where now we're going to get to the real denier stuff, that you feel like it's almost like a new season of the show kicks in. But I wanted to back up a little bit and just talk about the genesis of the book, because, when I had first talked to you years and years ago, you were working on a different book, and, then something happened. I don't want to spoil it for everyone. I'll let you tell the story, but tell us a little bit about how that came to be, so that you basically put down another project and had to pick up this project.
I had gotten, when you have a successful book, it often puts you in a really nice spot for the next book, so that you sometimes you'll notice with writers that you really like, that a book that is great, or a movie is great, the next thing comes out and it's not that great, but everyone in the culture is trying to catch up, so they overpraise it, and you want to say, no, this sucks. He or she has already done it, and it's less good. Embarrassingly, Matt, you know how much I love Tarantino, but I was crazy for Reservoir Dogs and for True Romance, and then when Pulp Fiction came out, it's like, I've seen him do this before, and it's not as uncompromising as Reservoir Dogs.
That's shocking to me, actually. It's shocking.
Seriously, we saw Reservoir Dogs the first night, and our mouths dropped open. It was just so cool and funny and mean and unyielding. And there was more yielding in Pulp Fiction. Now he's become way better than any of those movies. Weird thing is, do you remember what Wallace says about Tarantino in the Driving Around the Midwest book? Okay, by the way, isn't it funny to hear how somebody catalogs their own work? Yes.
The Driving Around the Midwest.
I was like, is that a self-reference, or okay?
I forgot
Tarantino is such a schmuck 90% of the time, but every so often I've seen genius shining off the guy. Right?
Yeah.
That's pretty accurate.
Right. Yeah,
pretty accurate.
Yeah. But since then, he is the greatest art director in the country. If you look at Death Proof and at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, those are just dialogue movies with very little action. I don't think there's any other director who could be willing to write as dialogue heavy a movie, and as Jack Bauer 24, 1 minute of screen time equals 1 minute of real time. Do a movie like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which only has a 4-minute action sequence. I mean, it's astonishing.
I would say I just watched The Whale, the new Aronofsky film, and that is basically like a stage play. It's all just dialogue in one.
But Dave, is it as good?
Oh, I wouldn't say it's as good. No,
yeah, okay,
probably not.
So I had to say successful.
Sorry,
quite right. No, you're right. That wasn't Dave. In terms of my gamble, where nobody would do that. How long is The Whale?
How long?
How many hours? Was it like
Oh,
3 hours? Like
no,
Once
it's
Upon a
probably
Time?
closer to around 2, I think. I watched it on an
Okay, remember
airplane recently.
he goes 3 hours.
In Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I
Yeah,
guess
that's
he
a
has
feat.
that anxiety scene, which is just a red herring when he visits Spawn Ranch and finds Bruce Dern. But there's only one action sequence. That's an amazing achievement, which he wouldn't have dared to try in 91.
Well, and let me ask you about this because people who have written a book and they then go through the experience of have people read it, review it, talk about it. You talk about it for a year or two,
Yeah.
and then you start having to, you're writing something new, and you now have this expectation. You were kind of alluding to this that like, oh shit, these same people are probably going to read this same thing. You sort of already know there's an audience that does exist of real people out there. How does that change the way that you write?
Uh, you're happy because you think that, okay, at least there's that anxiety when you're younger, which is nobody gives a shit, basically. So there's your little umbrella where you're doing warm work and then everything else is rain. And so at that point, you know that there is some warm room where somebody, you can come in and you'll sit down and they're looking at you expectantly and they're like, we were just waiting to hear the next thing you were going to say. So it's an incredible relief because before you cross that, it's just you and you just step outside of your desk area, your keyboard, and you get drenched by inattention or just disinterest, right? Not even inattention, just total disinterest. So that kind of thing is a pleasure. When I had finished with the book I wrote about West Point, which is similar, it's not at all similar to Wallace, except in two ways. So I'll leave it to you guys whether you want to cut this. But the whole time that I was there, I kept remembering David saying that we want the equivalent of a religion. We're dying to give ourselves away to something. And to go from talking for a week about Enfield, right, the Enfield Tennis Academy, to living at the military academy, I kept wishing the conversation was still going on, right? But then similarly, like the way I ended up doing that book was I just didn't want to do any kind of reporting. I just wanted to go back to writing short and long books of the kinds I was doing before I was getting to have experiences like driving around with David in the Middle West for 5 days. So I kept turning down interesting reporting jobs. And then Jan Wenner, who, for people who've read the Wallace book, that's the Jan that Dave keeps asking about. Is Jan paying for this, or what does Jan want?
Yeah.
He said, you've turned down too much stuff, and West Point is only an hour away, so you have to go do that story. And then I tried one more way of getting out of it, which is when I got to West Point, I said, this is a very nice military academy that you have here, but the only way I could do it justice is not by visiting for 2 weeks the way Jan Wenner wants me to, but if you would clear me to spend all 4 years here as if I were a cadet, let me go through all the training that we can reasonably do without terrifying your insurers, right? And then I went, no. There's no way they could say yes. And then I think I was like 2 or 3 weeks later, remember Jerry Springer when that used to be on TV? I found it really irresistible. I think I was watching it topless, like eating Doritos. Enjoying the feeling
As the
involving
world
coffee
turns.
trying to get the Doritos out of your chest
Chest
hair.
hair.
All yours can be a very time-consuming hobby.
Yeah. So is Matt.
So and then there was a call, and the very crisp military voice said, the answer is yes.
Whoa.
And so I had to do this thing because it would have been too embarrassing to explain. I was just, trying to avoid an assignment. And then that became a great book to write, and it was very successful. I ended up on the cover of the Times Book Review, and it was Disney bought it for the movies and for TV. And I think it's in the introduction to the Driving Around with David book. One very nice thing about it is I felt that I could send an email to David now, because it had just been, not that my book would enter the tennis ladder and square off from Infinite Jest, but it wasn't, in terms of the stature gulf, it wasn't as embarrassing. It would have been sort of unbridgeable. It's a weird thing because to do what all three of us do, you have to be slightly oversensitive, which is great once you're close to someone, but can make it impossible to just jump over what could either be a fisher, right? Could be a giant gulf, could just be a tiny fisher. But I was just too mortifying to me to. People in his family asked me, because apparently he had said very nice things about me when he came back. And they said, why didn't you ever reach out to him? Not despairing, they just were curious. And it was like, I couldn't until I was doing better in the field. And then it just seemed like that would be tacky too. But one of the nice things about having a successful book is you get options. It's not just that you have your little tiny umbrella and there's rain, and then there are a few places where you can go where people look at you and say, "Oh, we're curious what you're going to say next." For some time, the rain will stop. It's sort of a wonderful thing, right? If you succeed as a writer, all of a sudden, all that terrible anxiety sort of goes away for a bit. It comes back, right? But there'll be
I'm sure.
Book, and people will also want to reward you in various ways. In the same way that after not having loved True Romance and Reservoir Dogs, people were really ready to overpraise Pulp Fiction, or properly assess it, since you guys liked it immediately and I had to warm up to it. So I got the kind of deal that I'd always wanted. This is just a professional and a professional landmark. I got the size deal that my agent had always wanted me to get. And it was for a novel and for a book that I think still would be a great book. It was a book that answered a lot of questions about living in a metropolis in a way that I would want answered. And I still want to do the book next.
That's the one I do remember talking to you about that idea.
Yeah, and so I had gotten the deal, and I was sitting down to do it, and I began by researching electricity.
Holy shit, that took off from there.
And then if you were honest, you couldn't write the book anymore because you had to write the other book. And so then I had to learn how to tell this narrative.
And that's one thing I love about the book is that it's such a huge topic. It's such a bold thing that not many people, especially who, are not themselves science writers per se, are going to take this leap to say, okay, to tell this story, I have to go back to the invention of electricity. And I mean, that's a huge brave thing to do. And I think it totally works because I haven't read a book that is about climate told in this way at all. And, most of what I tend to read is fiction. And so it's rare that I even read nonfiction to begin with. And then reading it from someone who is a fiction writer, although you've written a lot of different, journalism stuff to begin with, I feel like that decision right there to say, I'm going to start with the invention of electricity and follow that thread really through the whole book. In a lot of ways was,
see light bulbs come back around at the end.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that, David, by the way. That was once I understood how the book was going to go. But Matt, you were building to a big compliment, and I got in the way.
So no. It's all I was saying is that it's a huge accomplishment that I'm glad that you took the 10 plus years or however long it took you to get to this point where we are now of actually having the book done and in our hands where we can read it. Because again, not many people have that luxury. Certainly not many first-time writers. And, someone who has established your record when you are going through all of the sort of twists and turns in your career to have ended up in this place. I mean, you must feel like when you were starting out, did you have the confidence that you would be able to get to the end of the story? Because there's so many threads here, man.
Wow. Dave and Matt, what's the outside that we can talk on the show? How long can we go? I'm just kidding.
There's no limit. There's no limit.
Oh, there's no limit. We typically average like an hour and a half to 2 hours in the regular section, and then like 20 or 30 for the bonus. So, yeah.
It was very complicated. Do you know? I knew what the design of the book was going to be pretty early, but
and let me just
wow. By the way, you see me just thinking
there
about it. So forgive me. What the listener just heard was the replacement of the confident the book is finished person who's going around and having great conversations, and then this conversation that David's right I've looked forward to for 8 years with the person on the other side who's thinking, how do I get this done? And so I'm happy I can now meet our listeners. This is the person who hasn't written the book yet. Yeah, it was unsettling, actually.
Well, and in some ways, I guess what I was getting at is it feels like it's almost like 10 books in one. That this very well could have been a story about electricity and energy as it leads to climate change. It could have just been the denier section. It could have just been all of the research you did. Yeah. Just the psychology of denial. Yeah. Like there's like 10 books in here, and so it's just such a huge task to tackle. Like, how did you approach the research that you did? Because there's so much of it in here, clearly.
There's a bunch of things that you said that the main thing is I wanted to do a book for people who read the things that we read, because once I understood just what the story was, which was unavoidable if you were researching how cities use electricity, it was a very upsetting story. One of the things for people who haven't picked up the book yet is that we had a pretty clear idea of what was going to happen. 1956, for example, the first great climate scientist, a man named Roger Revelle, warns readers of Time magazine, in about 50 years, this could have a violent effect on the Earth's climate. The book, as you know, is designed around his saying that. And then another great early climate scientist, not as famous as Revelle, a guy named Gilbert Plas, being interviewed by the New York Times on their science page, the Science Week in Review, in October of 56. And he says, we'll know for sure, let's say in about 30 years, by the 80s. And then the gimlet-eyed science reporter says, the introduction of nuclear power probably won't make much difference with regard to this thing called the greenhouse effect. And by the way, it was so well known by 1956 that Voldemort Kampfort, I can't pronounce his last name, that's an approximation, but Voldemort Kampfort said, Dr. Plas uses the familiar greenhouse analogy. Now, that's how well known in October of 1956 the problem with carbon dioxide being emitted from power plants and from tailpipes was. Yeah. He said the introduction of nuclear power will make no difference. Coal and oil are still profitably burned around the world, and there's every reason to believe they will continue to be burned as long as it is beneficial to do so. Mm-hmm. So that's 56, and then in the late 70s, and I'm sure we'll get to this. I hope we will. The president turns to the National Academy of Sciences. Did you guys know that we had a National Academy of Sciences before this?
I've heard of them, but I didn't know what they did.
So. I'm Canadian, so all that stuff is
Dave,
great.
well, welcome your country.
The Ministry of whatever.
Yeah, there's a rigorous, you have to be nominated by their scientists. It's a tremendous honor. It's a little bit, what flashed through my head is Ray Liotta's narration towards the end of Goodfellas. It's the biggest honor they can give you. Right? It's the biggest honor science can give you. And the National Academy of Sciences had warned in 77 that we had to change power sources. And if we didn't do it now, if we waited until you could see the effect of climate change, for all practical purposes, the die will already have been cast, since it takes a generation to change power sources. And so there were a number of reports like this that came out between 77 and 79. I know, Matt, we were talking about how I got into it, but this is part of how I got into it.
Yeah, no.
And so the President Carter, then was anxious about these reports, and then one from a number of scientists who work with the Defense Department who said, yeah, this is going to happen. So he went back to the National Academy of Sciences and said, could you just meet again? And it's a little bit like, it's in the book, so you guys will know, but did you remember the 1964 Surgeon General's report? Matt, I'm sure you do. Yeah. If you probably won't. Yeah. If you buy American cigarettes, it says the Surgeon General has determined smoking causes cancer.
Big warning.
64. Yeah. It would be, if you buy enough cigarettes, if you go to the same convenience store, they very nicely have a guy come from the back and he mementos it onto the inside of your phone. And then they sell you the special packs that don't have it written on the packs anymore.
Some countries have it worse. The warnings are the whole packet is.
Yes, England,
just
right?
like.
We don't even have branding on cigarettes anymore. It's just all black boxes with names.
Seriously?
And then pictures of someone's teeth with mouth cancer.
Rotted.
Seriously?
Yeah. And
I think
that's
England is
that's pretty recent, like where cigarette packages have just become all completely homogenized. And then the only difference on them is just the text. Yeah,
they should put that on certain kinds of books, like on Nikki Spillane books or on Ann Coulter books. The pictures of you reading it in a very lonely motel room. Like, warning, if you read this and really give over to it, you're going to become extremely isolated. I think we should extend this to more
solid black packaging behind the counter.
Music, film, television,
21 and over. You have to be 21.
So in 1964 or in 63, President Kennedy said, look, we need an actual answer. We've been looking at cigarettes for 9 years. The cigarette emergency begins, and it's part of this book. And so, Matt, one of the thrills about this book is that it really... So do you remember the joke that I was doing during the press on the Driving Around with David book, which is that it's like the Henry Ford equation, which is any two people in the front seat of a car will become friends if asked to drive in excess of 150 miles.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Similarly, if you're writing a book, and Matt, I know you've published your first book of fiction. Great. Dave, have you published a book or written a book?
I have not written a book.
There's a chapter in a book.
I have a couple of essays published in books, but that's as far as
if you publish a book and you stay comfortably under 300 pages or under 400 pages, if you're writing about West Point or you're writing about, a new cable channel, which is devoted to people suffering, my favorite Wallace. Beyond. Matt, after teasing you for wanting to name fancier things than Infinite Jest, that is my pick for fancy.
Okay.
I think it's the one I'm going to use later.
I love it.
But you will you'll know that you're writing about a channel that shows people unhappy, or you're writing about West Point. The minute you cross that, when you do page 400 plus 1, you feel that you're writing a book about America. From then on. So up to page 400, it's a book about climate change, but at 400 plus 1, it's about America for however many pages you go on.
That's a great comment, because one of my notes on this book that you've just published is that even though it's marketed as nonfiction, it lacks some of the trappings of nonfiction, which we'll talk about, which you have a website where a lot of the notes are. There's no index in the book. It reads more like a novel, and I would say an encyclopedic novel. And I have some examples of that, of how, not only your personality shows up, but the amount of information that you gathered into this. It's very clearly a book about America, and you reference other writers who have crossed that threshold in a way, like DeLillo and Updike being two who used, I think, America as their primary subject. But there's even some examples when you're reading an encyclopedic novel, if you're like, oh, damn, I never read a book that mentioned this before. And I have a couple of examples of that, which I'll get to in a minute, that stood out to me. So I actually had that written down as that this is an encyclopedic novel, even though it's nonfiction.
I agree with that.
So, Dave, that's wait, Dave, you were going to say something, but I just want to say that's why I asked the people at Norton to have us all talk, because I knew Matt would get that. Yes, Matt, that's the book, of course.
I love it.
And, no one I've been waiting. I think the pause. Can you tell there's a regular pause, and then there's like excited pause. You could tell, I assume, the excited pause. I've been waiting for that. And by the way, one only thing I would take issue with, Matt, is those are not some of the notes. That is
that is everything.
All the notes. That
everything.
Is 230,000 words of notes. That's a 250,000 words of notes.
And give us the URL. You got to give us.
It's
website,
the Parrot and the Igloo.com. So it's just you can make them all caps, or you can mix and match any way you want. But if you say www.theparrotandtheigloo.com, it will bring you to this site, which is there's a wonderful web designer named Scott Blackburn, and he and the brilliant copy editor. Sorry to be taking people, but it was difficult to do. A brilliant woman named Rachel Mandick put those up, and they are. You don't even have to have bought the book to read them, and
Right.
it's another book in there.
This was actually the
is,
first question that I wrote down as I was, reading through the book from the start. Was like, oh, I'm really curious about this choice in this nonfiction work. That there's no citations, there's no footnotes, there's no endnotes. I'm kind of just trusting that Lipsky has done the research and the work is going to be shown somewhere. And I'm flipping back for like endnotes. I don't see anything. And then I saw like that there is a long chapter note at this in the end, like in the epilogue, that would have made the book so unwieldy to carry that that we've made this decision to put it online. And I was like, and it led to like, I thought a really just very like pleasant reading experience, just existentially, of like, it didn't feel like I was reading like a bunch of academic reports or something, and I'm like stopping and checking and cross-referencing stuff. So it just led to like a really nice flow of reading, I thought. And the fact that all the backup work is there to check out if you want to dig into it is made for like just a really lovely kind of flow to this book.
I really appreciate you saying
So
that. By the way, I would.
Choice.
Yeah. It would have made the book triple and it's already 500 pages, so it would have made it 1,500 pages.
Yeah, it's Summa Theologica by that point.
But Dave, I would write like there is really, really funny stuff in the notes. There's stuff that I couldn't put in the book, but then even beyond it was just stuff that was not that it's wilder than some of the people who were in the denier section, but it's just more stories, and then charming stories about Einstein or about Edison that there was just no place for, but that I wanted the reader to have. So it really is, for people who have enjoyed the book, there is a slightly different book that is longer than the actual published book that's waiting there. But let me just finish up about what I was saying about the Surgeon General's report. So Kennedy asked the Surgeon General to form a panel, 10 experts to look into all of the cigarette studies and decide whether or not cigarettes cause cancer, because from 1954 until the early 60s, there was a giant fight brewing. And then in early 64, they said it's unequivocal, smoking causes lung cancer. Essentially, President Carter asked the National Academy of Sciences on a much more abbreviated time horizon to look into all the reports in between July 23rd and July 29th, 44 years ago, and say, hey, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And what they wrote was that the results of this brief but intensive review will be reassuring to scientists, but disturbing to policymakers. If carbon dioxide continues to increase, this panel finds no reason to believe climate change will not occur, and no reason to believe those changes will be negligible. And
there's just so many stories like that where I feel like we could just do a litany of, it's like a drumbeat, 1954, 1963, like you kind of just every decade, every year, there's unequivocal declarations that are being made, and the parallel drumbeat to that, of course, is, well, maybe there's a couple parallel. One is just lack of inaction, right? Or total. I mean, there's plenty of inaction. Yeah. No lack of it. No lack of it. But then there's also this other one that is, industry basically fighting it. There's another parallel track of lack of political will to do anything about it. So you have these sort of parallel tracks, and that they're going to crash at some point. And the one that's going to, lose out is what the scientists have been saying since 1954, 1956, or even going further back. Yeah. And you go way further back into the sort of invention of like humans and technology in a way, which is that there's going to be some downside to technology being invented. And yes, we can get, in FaceTime video. We can get a message from here to London in 10 seconds. Like, that's a great technology, but there's some cost to it. And with the cost that you start out is carbon, right? Like, we're putting carbon into the air, or sulfur in some places. Carbon
it's so
dioxide.
Weird. It's like a Rumpelstiltskin fable, isn't it? Also, you guys, so when I came across just what Matt was saying, I knew I had to write the story, and then I also knew, I love what Matt was saying, I knew how encyclopedic the story was going to be. But am I the only person, Matt? I feel that you and I have shared a cigarette, or at least shared an area where there was. I don't want to tell
in New York
tales.
back in the days. I mean, it's just like, what else is there to do? Stand on a street corner.
Yes, New York is known for its paucity of recreational alternatives. So it's just cigarettes.
There's
or
nothing
you
to
just
do.
sit there
That's it.
glooming. Yeah,
That's right.
but if you smoke cigarettes, like I remember that when I was when I was talking to David, I was going to quote a friend of Wallace's, probably about whom you and I have the same opinion. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to say that gentleman's name.
I know who you're talking about.
So David said he wrote stuff on nicotine. Very cool that he would put it that way, right? Nicotine, for people who used it as a stimulant, like, it speeds things up for you, right? It allows you to focus longer. It allows you to stay awake longer. And it's great. It's an enhancement. It makes things go faster, but you have to pay for it later. And it's no surprise. In a weird way, it's like a fairy tale in that the same people and the same approaches that people use to deny the effects, that long-term effects that tobacco had on the body, that we had the same effect on the planet, which is we could accelerate. Everything is faster because of energy, right? We can get from New York to San Francisco. Used to be, 34 days or something like that, and you had to play a video game when you were in grammar school to get from New York City to Oregon. So you had to factor all that in.
You died of dysentery.
But now you can get there 6 hours, right?
Can I do one quick sidebar on nicotine?
Yeah.
On nicotine, this is a sidebar, but it came up during the David Foster Wallace conference in Gettysburg in June. One of our presenters put a quote up from a Spanish writer named Carlos Busquet, and it was a tweet that said, and I might butcher it a little bit, as it's originally in Spanish. It says, "There is nothing more dangerous than a person who does not need an addiction to soften their relationship to the world, for such a person is as hideous as the world itself." And it's a fucking great quote, because I feel like, the path of becoming an enlightened adult is like, well, it would really be better if you gave up caffeine and alcohol and nicotine, and basically anything fun in life is bad for you. And David's number one addiction, he said, was television, right?
That's right.
And it's like, there's an addiction that we all have to something. You mentioned this, like, we're giving ourselves away to something. There's a common theme here. But there's also this hidden cost of, like, anything that you're addicted to is not only bad for you, but it's like got some really bad consequences for the world itself at large. Maybe that's too broad of a generalization, but
it's interesting. But let me say that. But like, I love and who's the Spanish writer again?
Carlos Busquet.
Busquets. Can you spell?
I know you don't read Spanish.
That's right. Now very
translation.
Yeah, Buscete.
Qued.
Qued.
Yeah.
Can we call them tweets anymore, by the way, or are they called X's now?
X,
like, what is the verbiage?
I'm saying
weird.
tweets, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm saying tweets.
Oh my God, I hadn't thought of that. But the planet's use of energy has been amazing. But the pace of change. There's a great thing that that Einstein said to Edison at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of electric lighting, and thus of human beings' daily use of electricity. He said that the great inventors, among whom you are the greatest, have placed mankind in an entirely new situation to which it has not accommodated itself yet. And so it's hard to imagine, like 1750, 1850 wouldn't be that different from 1650. Presumably the witch doctors of the period, right, would, if you broke your leg in London in 1650 or if you broke it in 1825, they'd have the equivalent of shaking their rattles over your ailing shin longer, but that's basically it. But giant changes between Samuel Morse, 1844, and now, an unprecedented pace of change. And part of what's driven it is electricity, and then also our use of fossil fuels to travel places. Now, it's astonishing. It's great. What an amazing addiction. But it puts us in an unprecedented spot, which is no bullshit. It's like a fairy tale problem. You can spin this straw into gold, which the king needs in the morning, but 20 or 30 years down the line, there's going to be a cost that's going to be required of you. And we have we've tried to go ahead saying there isn't going to be a cost, or maybe it's not true. And that's where we are. But, it's a weird thing because you guys know what magical thinking is, right?
Sure.
We were just talking about Diddy
our readers,
earlier.
our listeners. I always think of people as readers. That shows that shows my bias in favor of text. So I'm going to assume everyone knows what magical thinking is. You would reject the idea because we get suspicious of any deal that looks too good. If we're Catholic, we think it's our Catholic guilt. If we're Jewish, we think it's our persecution mania. But when we're offered a free lunch, we think this can't be real. And then we think, isn't it primitive? Isn't it cringing and primitive to think that there's going to be a cost paid? So in a way, sometimes when I've thought about global warming, I've thought it matches too much the basic architecture of our punishment advantage brains. Like we tend to think if we're getting something good, that something we'll have to pay for it. And this seems too obviously that. And so in a way, as a mature person, you think you have to reject this cost. But if you look at it in body terms, we have sped things up in a way. What Roger Revelle is famous for saying is that once he understood what we were doing, isn't it cool to bring Revelle back?
Yeah, there you go.
Once he understood in late 1956 what we were doing, that the carbon dioxide that we were burning was not going to be absorbed by trees and the ocean, but was just going to begin to collect. He said that humankind is in the middle of a grand geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have been performed in the past and could never be repeated in the future. We are returning to the atmosphere all the carbon that had been stored in rocks for millennia. And that's an amazing thing. And so that then is just unprecedented benefit, which is all the fossil fuel. I see you're getting ready to talk, Matt. But then the thing is, there's a bill coming, which is hard for us to accept, but also makes a certain kind of fairy tale sense.
Well, and I totally agree 100% with that psychological, the sort of biases that we have built in. But maybe what I was saying earlier was a little too simplistic, because even with the tobacco example of public health, there is a pretty good ending to that story, in that the use of tobacco has gone down dramatically, thanks in large part due to government regulation of marketing efforts.
Yeah, but Robert Proctor, who is a great scientist and professor at Stanford, he puts the death toll around 200 million people
for tobacco.
Yeah. And painful way to die.
And it's awful. So, and I think there are other public health examples that at least have had progress made on them. I mean, I was thinking of, seat belts, drinking and driving. There's a great article I found in the Newsday from like 1980, which you might remember, which was a famous op-ed in Newsday that was called "Drinking and Driving Can Mix." And there was actually like deniers for, drinking and driving or wearing seat belts. And the big one right now, I feel like, is guns as well in the U.S. And yet there are other countries that have solved this. Not solved it, but addressed it better. Yeah. And that this is a very sort of U.S.-centric approach that we have to dealing with public health in general.
Well, it's because you guys love freedom so much.
You don't have any freedom up there, do you? Do you have any freedom
none.
up there?
Yeah.
So you got to ask permission to buy an incandescent light bulb, which now banned. But you know what I'm saying, David? Like, there's some choices that we make with our elections and things that have consequences on public health, but there are other ones that besides climate that I feel like we have made some progress on for the better, and that that's what makes this problem so unique. You have two quotes in the book, at least from people who say you could not have designed a better problem to avoid sort of human psychology.
God bless you, Matt, for having seen that. In fact, the problem is so circular that in 1996, an economist at MIT says, if you wanted to come up with a problem human beings can't solve, you couldn't find a better one than global warming. And the problem itself is weirdly circular. So we keep going through the same process of accumulation of evidence, judicial weighing of that accumulated evidence, decision this is going to happen, and then it falls out of the news, and then 12 to 20 years later it comes back. So it's so circular that towards the end of the book, in 2015, the head of the Yale Center for Climate Communication says it's really the worst kind of problem for our underlining mental architecture. It's like, yes, such a terrible problem that somebody said the exact same thing.
And he didn't know that, right?
Yeah,
like, he didn't.
That is how deterministic our mental architecture is that the same, reputable people, MIT and Yale, pretty interchangeable. To a space alien, they'd be basically the same school. And here are these two people separated by a generation and a half saying the exact same thing. And still, just what you were saying about denying, I just couldn't resist. This is King James wrote the first monarch to write a public health treatise, and also maybe the first monarch to write an anti-denier essay. But he wrote a great thing in 1605 called A Counterblast to Tobacco. And he said, look, it's terrible. It's going to kill people.
Yeah.
Isn't it great? Yeah. And he said, and he also ran into deniers, because what he wrote is, and if a man smoke himself to death with it, and many have done, then some other disease must bear the blame for that fault.
Right.
Wow.
Like, even back then, it goes back, like being able to stir up doubt about something is a very strong human response. And anybody who grew up watching Jaws, of course, knows that in their bones. That was the only great joke. I love Paul Feige, but the only great joke in the Ghostbusters remake from 2016 is people keep calling Andy Garcia, who's the mayor of New York in the Ghostbusters reboot, they keep saying he's like the Jaws mayor. And he says, no, don't call me the Jaws mayor. I'm not the Jaws mayor. And I love that for some other people, the Jaws mayor is paradigmatic of being told something is going to happen and just going ahead and doing the same action anyway and sort of crossing your fingers extra hard.
It's like shorthand for turning a blind eye almost intentionally.
Turning a blind eye and an appealing rump at the same time. A meaty rump and a blind eye. Don't feel anything.
To a shark. But you even bringing up King James there as like an example of the encyclopedic nature of the book, and I love
that's
Wikipedia.
Beautiful. By the way, Matt, that's a beautiful segue. Holy God! Let's just pause for a second, because I was hoping that you would go back there, and that couldn't have been better. So yes,
I love Wikipedia rabbit holes. So I mean, Wikipedia to me is almost a stand-in for the idea of the encyclopedia. Now, I think it is one of the greatest inventions of our lifetime, and something I deal with in my day job, which is education is often not the problem for people. Like people, even with their budgeting things, they know like, don't spend more than you make, like write out a budget, have a financial plan. Like all these things are very basic, like finance 101 that people know, but where people get into trouble is with behavior, right? With psychology and biases that were built into, overconfidence, availability, the herding instinct that we have. Though that is actually where like a lot of the more sophisticated education comes in, which is like trying to understand the biases and the behavior. Like behavioral economics is a relatively new field. And I feel like that with climate, in that it's not almost a lack of education about the facts. It's really like our own biases in behavioral. Let me shelve that for a minute and go back to the Wikipedia thing, because when you brought up King James, I went from you've already mentioned Henry Ford. At some point reading this book, I was on the Wikipedia page for the history of the automobile. And that's a great Wikipedia page, because the first sentence of it is development of the automobile started in 1672 with the invention of the first steam-powered vehicle. And I was like, holy shit, this is some David Lipsky shit right here, where they're just like, they got to tell the story of the automobile. It's like, let's go back to the 1600s. Right. And I was just trying to see what was the first car. Was it the Ford Model T? Was it the Mercedes Benz? And it's like, you really got to go back into the 1600s to have that conversation.
It's the Fred Flintstone car.
Which is,
Yeah, that's the first one.
It was not steam-powered.
Well, by the way, but Dave, here's a weird thing about that, which is apparently there's one of the beliefs now is that mammals did coexist, and some early hominids did coexist with dinosaurs. So all the fun that we've made of people drawing, a man next to a dinosaur, apparently we have to make fun of our sense of that, which is weird. I was reading about that the last couple of weeks. But yeah, Matt, a friend of mine wrote a history of that. Also, one of the guys who's one of Napoleon's engineers is putting together one of the earliest cars, right? So yeah, I was so happy when you re-steered our craft back to the encyclopedic nature of the book. I knew pretty quickly. I knew that for the book to work, it would have to be a book that would be written for people like us to read, which is, yeah.
I would add too that it feels very literary. Like you use metaphors in this book with just like a shotgun blast liberality. It is wonderful. I just kept writing in the margins like metaphor, metaphor, metaphor. Like horror movies got it right.
I appreciated your metaphor there, Dave.
Yeah, like so I ended up just writing like metaphors like dozens of times as I read this book, and so
let's hear them.
Well, I just noted them in the
Let's
margins a lot.
Happy to hear them.
One I really liked was the page 238 one about horror movies got it right. You rattle every door when being pursued. And
yeah, it's so
like
good,
about,
isn't it?
About Marlboro, the cigarette company, and just like
yeah. No, that guy. So the guy who's doing that there, he's a vice president for Marlboro, and the thing that's going to kill them, and it's going to lead to them supporting the most effective climate deniers from the beginning, is that the EPA has classed secondhand smoke as a Group A carcinogen. So if you're sitting next to somebody on an airplane and they're smoking, you're smoking. And so it's what they've feared this for 10 years, and they feared it since the cigarette emergency began. And so it's just like a horror movie. You will rattle every door. This vice president gathered 900 editors of historically African-American publications, Black publications. And he said, if we want to keep bias out of American life, you have to protect smokers because, and then he goes for it. He says, today, my right to smoke might be under attack. Tomorrow, it will be the rights of underrepresented minorities. Like, you would actually do that.
Right.
Shocking. So, yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's another good one, page 357. There turned out to be a reason. Moncton had been diagnosed with Graves' disease. It gives the Lord's eyes their look of perpetual emphasis, as if he is forever disputing a tennis line call, staring down an argument, or alerting a friend to an open fly. All the stuff about Lord Moncton in this book is just fascinating. Like, what an interesting character. And like, not in a good way necessarily, obviously. He's a villain, but he's like an interesting villain, all the stuff about his puzzle that he made and offered $1 million to whoever could first solve it. That was so intriguing. There's so many just like weird little sidebars in this book that are so
what
fascinating.
Dave is talking about is one of the interesting things, like the deniers who have kept the planet. It's an amazing, like, if presumably we will solve this problem in the next 20 to 100 years, or there won't be people to look back with fondness and impatience on this period. Excuse me, the way we look back with fondness and impatience and incredulity and shame at the past. But one of the things that will interest them is it's like something like Justice League of America if it was just Batman who's not powered. Like, the deniers, when they give their membership, one of the main deniers says there's really just 25 of us doing this. It's very ragtag, right? They frustrated the national will and the international will, right? Because America was the number one polluter until I think 2008, when China took that very smudgy crown from us. But still, America was required. Like Europe said, we're turning to America to play its essential role in leading the organization for fighting climate change. And 25 people. That's all it took to frustrate the will of the world. That is astonishing. And so when you look at the people, it's even more astonishing. A man named Viscount Christopher Moncton was the lead denier. He became the lead denier from about 2007 on. And like all the other deniers, he has a surprising backstory. He just wanted to be in Parliament, and he has a beautiful Hugh Grantish accent. I think that's his basic quality. He has, he would have the accent that
draws him.
He has. He just sounds like, certainly for people here, and I imagine for people in England, it's a voice that you're, in the same way that dogs are primed if you speak in a loud voice or if you rattle a can of change, they're primed to sit down and take you seriously. His voice sounds so educated. That was the basic gift he had, but he was clearly crazy. And so he tried to be in Parliament. He tried to be in government, couldn't get elected to Parliament. And then when he failed to, when he realized he couldn't be elected, and when he was asked to leave Mrs. Thatcher's government, he then claimed that his Graves' disease, he does have Graves' disease, that had required him to be sidelined. So that's the way he would present his story in the press, as he had this very promising career. But then, he tried to become an editorial writer, and he was the kind of editorial writer who in the late 80s would say, Martin Amis, for example, who I know you guys just did a story on, he was writing about AIDS in that decade. He said, look, the only answer is we're all in this together. And that is one kind of writer. Christopher Monckton said, we have to round up anybody who tests positive for AIDS and sequester them on an island. It won't be inhumane. There can be supervised visits towards them from family members and other loved ones. Then he was forced out of that job. Then he claimed that he was sidelined by his Graves' disease, but he kept getting speeding tickets on his motorcycles. And then he came up with an idea for a puzzle. He could do something that would out Rubik's Cube. And so he said, this can't be solved. He put a huge amount of money into it and said, there'll be $1 million prize.
Especially by mathematicians.
Yeah, exactly.
Computers.
No mathematicians.
And then
it'll take at least 3 years to solve it. Two Oxford mathematicians with their computer solve it. One of the members of the solving duo is considered one of the 10 best mathematicians in the world. And then he has to pay out. And so then he has to sell the castle.
Liquidate the castle.
Yeah,
it's such a great story.
And then someone says, hey, you seem like a mighty smart fellow. Would you look into climate change? And he's the kind of person who says, I don't think you can do all your learning in libraries. So he says later on that he spent about a month rootling around in the research. And then he he sent this report to the fellow who had hired him to say climate change wasn't going to happen. And his friend was impressed with it and gave it to the Daily Telegraph, I think. And it's just the news everybody would want to read in 2009. The science says this isn't going to happen. And look, we all would like to keep spinning fossil fuels into gold and never have to pay Rumpelstiltskin anything, right? People were so thrilled by it. There were so many hits within the first 24 hours that it crashed the newspaper server. And then this man who had failed at everything else in his life and had no scientific training, he was lodged as the lead denier for about a decade. And when people would ask him what his qualifications were, he would say, well, I invented the eternity puzzle. That was the name of his puzzle that was solved within the year. Yeah. And so that makes me a mathematician.
I have a question written down. Who, for you, David, is the most likable villain or the most colorful villain in this book? And I would say Monckton probably would be mine.
Yeah, the most colorful. Yeah, he's also in a weird way the most benign. Although what he's saying is awful. By the time you guys, you guys have dealt with people who will maintain an argument, and then there's a great moment. Do you guys read Joan Didion?
I think
I've read talking about her a little bit.
I've read her all, but I have mixed feelings, to be honest.
A little bit.
So. Matt, what are your mixed feelings?
She's too conservative. She's pretty conservative, and
her politics,
and insular in a lot of ways. I mean, I think she's a fantastic writer at the sentence level. I'm very interested in a lot of her memoirs later in life are just gorgeous. And I really love, the book she did with her husband, Monster, John Gregory Dunn about the movie. But, a lot of her, I guess I've been influenced by our mutual friend, Maria Bustillos, who really hates Didion. Anyways, I can see some of both sides on her, but you tell us how you love her.
Yeah, no, it's hard not to be influenced by Maria because everything she says is so passionate,
convincing.
Yeah, exactly. So I just had the benefit of not having had that.
Yeah. Well, don't just don't.
Yeah. She's talking. She wrote a great piece. She was one of the only people who knew that the Central Park Five were innocent. And how do you not love a writer? Everybody else is saying they're guilty and they should be strung up. And she literally is the only writer I know to have said in print and at length, I don't think these guys are guilty. But she was talking in that essay. It's called Sentimental Journeys, and it's collected in, Prime Vintage Didion, the vintage collection of her best stuff. And I love that she put that in there. I assume it's her greatest hits, that she's the curator. But she's talking about how crimey New York was in the 80s. And so she said that she and her husband were chased into one of those electronic stores that they have around Times Square. They always have like going out of business sign in the window, et cetera. And they wrote in, they said, can you call the police? We're being chased by a large number of people. And the guy behind the counter says, oh yeah, the criminals, they prey on tourists like you. And then she said, no, my husband and I were New Yorkers. And then the guy instantly segues. And he says, well, that's why they didn't catch you, because you're New Yorkers. So one of the interesting things about, like, socially, we know that people who commit to a lie, they can never then say, okay, you got me. Right? I think that hasn't happened outside of the Western in American life.
Yeah.
Maybe certainly like either the 1890s or 1880s of movies, or just the 1880s or 1890s of our country. But there was a great thing, the Renata Adler, who is very much like
Speedboat.
Yeah. She said there's a great line from her book Speedboat, which I think this chapter is set in like 75. She said the jig was never up. Like, you never had to say, I did it, right? So someone like Longton, once he's confronted with the data, he just says, okay, it is happening, but it's better just to sit back, relax, and enjoy the sunshine. And so that's the only thing. When you were saying, like, he's the most fun one in a way, something about him saying that, like, okay, it is going to happen, but we shouldn't do anything, that gets my blood up. Dave, what did you make of Delingpole?
Remind me again. There's a lot of figures in this book.
He's the Martin Amis superfan. He's the last denier to get their story told. So he comes at the end of the book. He's someone who loved Martin Amis so much that he would go up to Amis at a party and he would say, people say I look a bit like you. Do you think I look a bit like you? And if he kept really wanting to become like Amos, and then when that didn't work, it's a little bit for him the way it is for Monckton. When Monckton couldn't get into Parliament, and when he didn't make the money from selling the Eternity Puzzle, and he had to pay out the $1 million, then he changed to denial. Delingpole really wanted to be Martin Amis, and then when that didn't work, Climate Denial offered him a different avenue to fame.
So it's page like 431 is where a lot of this stuff is occurring.
And that's one of the ones that Delingpole probably is among the ones that made me most angry. Weirdly, Dave, I have affection for Fred Singer, just because the Fred Singer story touches so many weird parts of the country.
The Moonies.
The Moonies. Yeah,
the Moonies section is phenomenal in this book.
Thank you.
That.
Yeah, it's really good. I should
the Mao to DeLillo.
Oh, wasn't that great to have that in there? Yeah,
so great.
The transfixed stare.
He's gonna say Mao too, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's what. So you knew it was coming. That's great.
Yeah. I read the writing.
That would be great. But like Fred Singer's story, and that's like when I said earlier that once you cross the page 300, the page 400 barrier, your self-depiction shifts from writing a book about climate change from writing a book about America.
Right.
In this case, it's defensible. Like Fred Singer's story, that's the section where the text gets to quote Joan Didion. She's talking about the former Bishop of California. And she said about him, his journey took him through every charlatanic thicket of American life. And I love that. Come on, how do you not love Joan? Let's get Maria.
I think she's a Californian. There's a New York Joan Didion, then there's a California Joan Didion. And I think Joan Didion during the Reagan years, there was a sort of haze over her politics. And I think you can look at it differently, but I haven't nothing good or bad. I'm not going to go down this road, David. I'm not going to take the bait. I'm not going to take the bait. But
okay,
I do
go ahead,
to bring, because you're bringing up Fred Singer and the Moody stuff. Yeah. To go back a little bit in the book to just before that, when we're in the thick of the tobacco wars, there's a guy. Gary
Gary
Huber.
Huber.
And so Huber ends up in my hometown, which is Tyler, Texas. That's where I grew up. And so I was like, okay, this is a true encyclopedic novel in that you have a story about Tyler Junior College, which is where my brother John went for a year. And like this is like page 230. I flagged it. And, this is a sort of guy who maybe did say he was wrong or change his mind about tobacco. Like, I wasn't really sure. You kind of talk around him a bit and that he changed in some way, right? He sort of landed in the middle of nowhere, kicked out by these Harvard scientists who were looking to defend the tobacco industry. Like, tell his arc a little bit, because I think it does get to that.
Yeah, I was gonna read the last page of that because I think it's funny.
Please do.
Matt and Dave, like, you guys understand who I wrote the book for. First off, it was just, I thought that the only way to, since misunderstanding served both the people who wanted to keep cigarette smoking legal and really served once that strategy was clear and pioneered, clearly effective and available for study by fossil fuel, and then promulgated, right? Used by fossil fuel with the same personnel who had done it for cigarettes. It's clear that just misunderstanding serves shitty people.
Yeah, sure, go for it. Fuck it.
Yeah, please do. Fuck it, say shitty.
So it just seemed like, and misunderstanding, and also the idea that it would be too hard to learn about it served people who didn't want to do anything. So I thought, okay, I want to do a book for people who just like to read. And them not knowing about this issue has allowed the issue to persist. And if I can get the people like me, like Matt, like Dave, like Maria to read this story, then we can presumably they'll watch. When you guys watch the news or read a news story now, you know exactly what the game is that's being played, right?
Yeah.
You know exactly what the arguments are. You can tell what political strategy. It's like watching people play chess. If you understand all the chess openings, you're like, they're not going to use the international argument again, or I can't believe that they're really going to try that. The reason it has those stories, and I love what you were saying about an encyclopedic novel, is I wanted to write something like The Godfather that would just be an effing. See, I
it's fine. Go ahead.
It would be a fucking thrill just to read. You would read it, you would love the story. And then you would also have learned both how we were a polluted country, right? Because it also tells the story of pollution and how that was controlled. One of the great comedy things, I'll get to Huber. Huber is 40 seconds away now.
Bring it in.
It's like on the old HBO when they would say the movie's going to drop in 40 seconds. One of the great gags, it's such a weird story we've been living, is that we got so polluted from 1940 to about 1985 that it was hiding global warming. And so when the Clean Air Acts internationally began to clear the skies, that's when the warming really started to speed up. Now tell me that's not wild. So here's what I mean about that. So I'm going to push Huber back another 60 seconds. And this is in the book, and it was really fun to write about. Do you guys know what the Year Without a Summer was?
Yeah. Was that the Mount
Pinatubo? That was July for me.
Yeah. Pinatubo is we got a year with a very strong winter out of that, and that messed up global warming.
You're right.
By the way, this is Dave. Did you laugh at this joke? Which is, at a certain point, you have to accept that God seems not to want there to be a solution to global warming. Because, in the early 90s, when the science was coming together and people in the House of Representatives, senators, and all the scientists were signing on, Mount Pinatubo blew up the spring of 92.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe 93. I should know that, but I have the rest. The other volumes of the encyclopedia are budding for space on the shelf. Essentially, volcanoes put so much sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that they will change how much sunlight we get.
Yeah.
And the biggest example of that, when there are dependable records, is Mount Tambora, which went up, I think, in the spring of 1816. And for a year, the next year, there was no summer. And it caused food shortages. So about 200,000 people died across Europe. There were food riots. They were eating moss and clover in Switzerland. And in England, the writers who were surrounded around Shelley. and Byron, they went indoors for the summer. And when they came out, The Year Without a Summer is 1817, they had invented the horror genre. That was the year that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein because all the lighting was weird and scary. And Byron's physician wrote a book called The Vampire, which is where Dracula comes from. But when something giant like that happens, it will change culture going forward. Now, that's because volcanoes just spray a huge amount of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That essentially is what smokestacks do. All the terrible pollution that we had, like they can say, weirdly enough, they can say what date smog started in Los Angeles. I believe it's July 8th, 1943. The reason why there wasn't smog before that was you had industrial activity, but not tremendously focused industrial activity. And during World War II, the number of factories in LA went, this is why I don't have the year from Mount Pinatubo. The number of factories in LA went from 1,500 to about 8,500. And so within, I guess, about a year and a half of the war starting, all of a sudden you had smog.
Right.
And smog is just a way of, sulfur dioxide and other things hiding the earth from sun. Once Clean Air Act policies and prohibitions began to take effect, Clean Air Act comes into EPA, and Clean Air Act, first one is in the 60s, more restrictive in the 70s. Once it actually begins cleaning up the air in the 80s, the sulfur dioxide is cleared out, right? Because we have less smokestack pollution, and the warming really picks up from about 85, 88 to now. Now, that to me is hysterical, and it's part of what I mean about the weird fear / feel of living in a fairy tale. Like, okay, you can have your clean air back, but in fact, it's going to speed up the warming. And before we get to humor, one last thing about that is the solution. The first solution we'll see to warming before anything else is Edward Teller, who was one of the people who helped develop the hydrogen bomb, and Wallace Broecker, who's one of the great early climate scientists. What they both began to advocate in the 90s is we have to get a fleet of jumbo jets and fill them with sulfur dioxide dust and have them go into the stratosphere and just dump it out the sides of the airplanes to simulate pollution so that we can cool the earth down for a year or two.
David, have you read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future?
No,
I
but
just
it's about
read that
that
right before reading this book, and so it was
yeah.
a very serendipitous moment of these two books back to back. And India, the country, does that in that book because there's a heat wave that kills like hundreds of thousands of people in the semi-distant future.
So those are all part of the encyclopedic and cool thing of telling the story. And then the way to tell the story was also to have narratives in a way that's not dissimilar, Matt, to the narratives of the people who were at Enid House, the narratives of the people who both found the science and also lied about the science. So Huber. So Gary Huber is just one of the foot soldiers, and it's a short story. It's about 2,000 words, right? And he's just someone who comes from intense poverty. He's from the Pacific Northwest, and this detail, all my friends, when they were reading
oh my God.
Yes, it's impossible.
Yeah. When I read that, I was like, that is poor, man.
Yeah.
So his mother took a job as a wallpaper because she could eat the wallpaper paste. It's insane.
Right.
And their home had dirt floors, and then Gary Huber was tall and a good athlete, and so he rebounded and foul shot his way to Harvard Medical School. And then while he was there in the 70s, he reached out to tobacco and wrote a series of seductive letters, which made it clear to tobacco that he would do the research the way they wanted it done.
Right.
And so he attracted a lot of attention. He attracted a lot of funding, rather, to Harvard. The tobacco industry, they understood that they would lose the argument. And so the basic thing, and this will be familiar to anybody who has ever dealt with a parent or a kid who doesn't want there to be a decision reached, or has ever dealt with a lover, the idea was not to prove was not to contest the outcome of the argument. The idea was to keep the argument going. Have you guys had
Just
boyfriends or girlfriends where it's just, exactly. No, but it's great. Like let's say, for example, your partner wants you to buy a car, or they want you to go on a vacation that you know is just ruinously expensive, or Steve or Matt, you're working on some book and you know that in February that's going to be a period when you have to do a lot of work on the book, right? But you also don't want to piss off your partner.
Yeah.
Right. What you'll come up with is let's keep thinking about this. Let's not reach a decision now. And then by January, you'll be like, that's too late to buy tickets. So let's think about this for another year, right? So we all are familiar with that strategy. That was the strategy that was taken by tobacco, that was then wonderfully copied by fossil fuel, which is the idea wasn't to win the argument. The idea was to keep the argument going.
Yeah, exactly.
And
more research is needed. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when they saw Gary Huber, they were like, think what it's going to look like for us in public relations stuff. We can say, our public affairs offices can say, clearly it's not absolutely firm that tobacco causes cancer, or why would Harvard Medical School be taking our money to study the problem? Yeah. And so he worked for them for about 8 years on what was called the Harvard Project, and every tobacco CEO would visit because they're at Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Harvard, which all these Harvard politicians and Harvard doctors have been making, been giving them hot feet, right? They've been making their lives unpleasant. And now suddenly they can go and visit, and they can go to the Harvard Club. And he becomes very close to the main lawyer who's defending tobacco. And, they're flying him everywhere. One of the great quotes in that section is that somebody else who worked on that effort says, on a daily basis, on an annual basis, it made me uncomfortable what we were doing, but it made me uncomfortable to think about our actions. But when people keep flying you first class, it tends to keep you doing what it is you're doing. Mm-hmm. But Huber was in a certain way fundamentally honest. And so his research led him to saying, hey, this is causing emphysema.
That quote, by the way, reminded me very much of an old Upton Sinclair quote it's great, difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And I thought of that a lot when I worked for an educational assessment company that did all the standardized testing in Texas and in other states as well. And I would sometimes get into arguments with people who were very much anti standardized testing, and I felt like I'm working at like a communist child pornographer company. In their minds, everyone hated my company so much, and I was like defending it in a way that's like, well, I had to admit my salary did depend on me defending it, right? Like in a way, I was very much had drank the Kool-Aid on it, because I had to, if I wanted to pay the rent, I needed to toe the company line in some way. But I also sort of like, when you work in a field, let's say you work in the hospital business and you're in the hospital every day, and then you go and read some newspaper article written by someone who spent a day there. I'm sure you're this way with West Point, right? Like, you live at West Point for 4 years, you go and meet someone who is like, oh yeah, I spent a couple hours there, I think it sucks. And you're just like, well, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And you would feel this for whatever industry you're in. And it could be tobacco, it could be, climate science. But, that idea that, like, I could see how those tobacco scientists would get sucked into it in a way, is that if they do want to keep flying first class, if you do want to have a job, maybe keep doing what they're telling you to do. And it's very hard to see a way out of that.
I would also add to that, and I wonder if you felt this too, like another one of the deniers. I tried to tell stories, Dave, of people at every level of denial. So there would be someone from the corporate world, right? Mm-hmm. Then there would be someone, that's Ellen Merlot, is who I was talking about with regard to what Matt was saying, with regard to only people on a certain level would understand how funny it is to say
with respect to.
Yeah. And then with Phil Cooney, it's someone who's working for government doing it, right? But for Ellen Merlot, it's like what Matt was saying, your coworkers, and they're basically decent, even if what they're doing maybe isn't right. And so you step forward to protect them that way. It's difficult. And these kinds of problems tap into even some of the good sides of our basic psychology in a way that can be devastating to the commonweal. Yeah. I think about the tobacco guys, the narrator of the book, and the person who goes around talking about the book is different than the person who wrote the book.
Wow, that's an interesting idea.
Look, if you want, So do you guys, I'm sure I'm looking at you and I see you're both big Henry James fans.
Not as big as you, but I'm a fan. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But do you remember the story?
I'm vaguely familiar with stuff
yeah.
as a result of doing certain scholarship stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so he wrote, I think there's a collection called The Private Life and Other Stories. He, in the second half of the middle part of his career, he wrote ghost stories, and he also wrote like charming. Yeah. There was a vogue for ghost stories. Wharton wrote them too. But he also wrote like charming science fiction, Richard Matheson Twilight Zone stories. One of them is The Private Life, which is one of my favorite James stories. And so slyly, I found a way to quote it in the book just to show how matches ended up being really useful for cigarettes to lodge. So Henry James, I think in 1891, said, my hand was on my matchbook in my pocket, which I always carried so I could smoke wherever I needed to. And for me, it was the fun of quoting my favorite story here. I know that Robert Browning comes up in every episode.
Sure, and his wife, Elizabeth Browning, for sure.
Yeah,
naturally.
But Browning was incredibly, was to them one of those beautiful voices like Nabokov, where you can't get over just how lovely his language is. I don't hear it probably the same way that Henry James or Wharton would have heard it, but apparently really impressive and charming as a literary voice. But then in his personality, he was just like a drummer, which I think is like a 20s or a 30s word for like a heavy salesman of their own stuff. Like almost a way that's coarse, like always upselling his own achievements and always talking about sales, or about, I guess, do poets, 1870s poets talk about sales? But it was shocking how wonderfully aesthetic his writing is, and just how pedestrian he was as a human. And so in the story, it's just something that James kept noticing in his notebook. And so in the story, the narrator is at the table, or to use Jamesian phrasing, the narrator is at table with the character who is like Browning, and he gets up for an indisputable need or something that you couldn't mention in the bathroom. No third person or first person phrasing for lavatories existed between, I guess, 1810 and about 1910. Because books were pretty outspoken. Like Rabelais is basically all about trying to find proper accoutrements for bathrooms. Yeah. But he goes to the bathroom, clearly, and he's coming back, and he gets lost in this big house, and he walks down a hall that is different than the one he was walking up, and there's a light from a door about 2/3 of the way down the hall, and he peers in, and there's Browning. There's stacks of manuscripts and stacks of books and like thrown away pens because the poet's been writing so hard, and he's not well shaven. This is my imagination. His hair is all wild, and he looks at the Henry James character incuriously, and then he gets back to his writing, and then the Henry James character is shocked, and he walks back to the table, and the other Browning is still there, and he realizes that in fact it's not just that they're different personalities, there are literally two different people. There is the person who talks about the work and tries to sell the work, and then there's the person who actually does the work. And I thought it was kind of great for James to have felt that. So
that's you.
That's
you.
What
okay.
I was saying,
yeah.
Which is So the narrator of the book points out that in a way these people were really great. It wasn't that they were disloyal to the rest of the country by pushing on people a product that would end up killing 100 or 200 million humans worldwide. It's just that they got too skilled at taking that was a great story to tell. People who she knew were great, even though what they were doing was terrible. Anyway, Huber's problem isn't so much that. Huber just, when he gets to the point he's been enjoying the company of these people, they've been introducing him to senators, and to when the Israeli prime minister comes, they introduce Huber to the prime minister. The head of the tobacco defense program, the lawyer who develops their hard shell strategy, is teaching him how to be a witness. He mentions, this really isn't the safest thing. Bang, everything's over.
Right.
and then they end the funding. He ends up at
Junior college,
Junior College with just his Harvard chair. He brings his Harvard chair with him, which I found so touching.
So I was probably there at the same time as him, and I will bring this around to another character in the book, which was Tyler Junior College. 1992 was the time where I saw Bill Clinton and Al Gore on their bus tour across the United States. After the Democratic National Convention, they went on a bus tour, Bill and Hillary, Al, and Tipper Gore, and they made all these stops all across the U.S. And we went out. My brother, John, drove me out to Tyler Junior College, and the bus pulls up. Bill and Al get off the bus in their rolled up shirt sleeves and, give this great talk. And I feel like we could have talked for an hour about Al Gore. Al Gore plays a pretty big role in the book. And in a way, a lot of the book is like a somewhat linear political history. And, obviously we see the same cyclical pattern that you're talking about earlier, where things get brought up, even, Nixon and the EPA. And then there's, we need to do more research. And, surprisingly, even the first Bush, right? He's more determined than his predecessor to make some kind of a change. Huh. But in the end, and I was also thinking earlier when you were talking about Huber of this moment where Stephen Chu under Obama starts saying something a little bit off message, and Rahm Emanuel knocks him on his ass of saying, get back on message, shut up. Don't be talking about how this could be bad. Don't use the word climate, all of that sort of messaging. So there's great stories in there. And, I have probably tons of more of these I could go through, but really one of the last, if not the last question I want to ask you is about boiling the frog. And, if you could design a climate book to come out this summer, pretty good choice, right? And that I'm sure that's helped you. It's in the news every day. It's all anyone in Austin, Texas can talk about today is how fucking hot it is. And we're going to break the record for hottest summer in Austin history. Phoenix is the hottest summer in Phoenix history. We thought we had it bad in 2011 here, where it was 110 every day for 20 days in a row. We're probably going to double that record this summer. And so it's just, absolutely excruciating we're at now. And you have this analogy of boiling the frog. You bring this up in a pretty interesting chapter of, we've turned it up. Eventually there is something that jolts the frog out of the water, right? You get to some point where you're jolted into action. Do you think there is something that will jolt us into action? Is it this summer of breaking records? What is that jolt?
The scientists thought that it would be something like this. So with the ozone thing that happened in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, yeah, the CFCs and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we were using a product for shaving cream and
hairspray.
And it would, hairspray, and it would just you'd press that nozzle on top of the can. James Bond will use it if he is being menaced by a snake in a hotel room in the southern hemisphere. We think the snake has him, but then he will turn around and he will hold his cigar to the front of the spray can, and it becomes a flamethrower. So those are the CFC cans. It turned out that these charming things were eating away at the ozone layer, which is like the suntan lotion that keeps everyone on Earth from getting skin cancer, and also cows. Other mammals will get skin cancer. In New Zealand, that is still the greatest affliction for cows, is skin cancer caused by the damage that we did to the ozone. Learning that, I remember the New York Times had a great editorial that came out, I think in the later 70s, and they said that learning that our shaving creams and our deodorants and our hairspray could eat away at something necessary like that was like learning that eating candy causes earthquakes.
Right. Yeah.
So what happened was they knew that it would be bad, but they didn't know the form the badness would take. And then instantly, within about a year, this problem that could not be solved by diplomacy was ironed out in what was called the Montreal Protocols, and everyone banned those gases over about a 20-year period. Now, to people in government who understood that the biggest fight was going to be about climate change, they were very anxious about that deal because they knew that it would become the format for deals to come about global warming. So what the scientists have always hoped since the late 80s, I think the Montreal Protocol comes in 89, they assumed something like that would happen for climate because the scientists who knew about climate had known about it since the 50s. There's one of my favorite quotes in the book, and it's in that first set of quotes. And then, Matt, I want to show you something about what the fun is of writing a long book, which I'll show you, which is in the table of contents for the book. Just because I was thinking about the quotes. But this quote from the Sherwood Rowland, who won the Nobel Prize for the ozone research, he said this great thing, which I think applies to so many avenues of our daily lives and absolutely applies to our national scientific life. He said, what's the point of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all you're willing to do is sit around and wait for the predictions to come true?
Yeah. That comes out a few times.
Yeah, but what the climate scientists saw is more optimistic, which is when there's an emergency, you get relief actions. So the climate scientists, for better or worse, knew that it would take something like the last 2 summers, and especially this summer. Problem is, it's not like Westeros. Our summers only last from May until October. I mean, to me, I was disturbed. You didn't think you'd be hearing George R. R. Martin. I was really disturbed when there was no snow for the first time in a winter in my lifetime, and I think in 70 years there was no snow in New York City this year. But when the heat ends, just the way we are organized as people, this is what that MIT economist and also what the professor from the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication meant, our attention will be directed somewhere else. So I don't know. I would like to think that this summer will lead that way. But the frog, this was a pleasure for me to write. So Al Gore uses an analogy which has become so well used now that when people bring it up, I roll my eyes a little bit. Do you guys too? It's that frog thing, which is, you guys, Dave, you know this analogy, which is if you put a frog in boiling water, it just jumps right out because it senses danger. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water or chilly water and just, room temperature, the frog will boil without realizing that's happened. And so the business magazine Fast Company, they just thought they would check that out.
Test that,
yeah.
Turns out the frogs jump out way before.
like the one that's put in hot water jumps out, I think, in 1.5 seconds. And the one that's put in slightly heating water is out within 4.5 seconds. So the funny thing is, the only creatures that will do that if slowly heating water is humans. They're the only people. Even frogs won't do it. That's why I love when you brought it up. That's one of the points of the book, is that only us, but I think finally even we are noticing how hot the water has gotten.
And at the end there, you have a chapter that starts where you say, writing this book can make an unpleasant person, right? And I think it's also, it's unpleasant to spend so much time around unpleasant people, but it's also like deeply existentially like depressing in a way that it can be hard to articulate. I don't know if you feel like that level of depression or hopelessness.
Oh God! Wait, no, Matt. Wait a second. Yeah. Well, let's just talk about it now. Dave, you've had less time to read the book, but I kept sending Matt copies of this book, manuscript.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
So he's had a huge amount of time.
Okay.
Matt, I wanted to make this book as fun as anything anyone could read this year.
And it is totally fun, and I'm saying it has led me to still feel depressed, and not that the book makes me depressed, but thinking about what you just said of like no snow in New York City, 120 degrees in Austin, like that, the facts are depressing, not the book.
My sense is that the Kim Stanley Robinson, do I have his name? Am I saying his name properly?
That's right.
Like, they are going to try that experiment, and it will work. It'll cause some trouble. Like the sky will be white. Yeah. Does Robinson write the sky is white over India when they do the experiment? Like, it turns it white. which is weird.
I think
it would just be a
probably.
freakish thing, right?
Yeah.
It's depressing because we're people, but it's also like we're people. I mean, are you depressed when you watch Hamlet or Lear? It's more like this is what we are as a species, and we can do amazing. Yeah, exactly. And we can invent problem-solving machines that also cause long-term problems. And so, to me, it's weird actually. Like one of the things that I thought was interesting about David Wallace, is that he understood what people were like, and it seemed to cause him great unhappiness, right? Like the shortest chapters in brief interviews, the brief history of post-industrial life. That one never knew why. Well, now did one, now did one, now did one. Yeah. Like you can also find that extremely funny. Yeah. Because it's humanity repeating its firmware.
I showed that to my English 9 class this year, and they were just kind of dumbfounded by it. They're a little young, but like...
I'm honestly not an extreme depressive, but I do have 2 kids, and you hear this of like, well, we don't want to leave this sort of fucked up world for our kids, and I guess I've been rethinking that lately of saying that to me is a cop-out in a lot of ways to say, well, we've already left them with a pretty fucked up situation. Like, forget when I'm gone. When I'm here now and my kids are, in their 20s and I'm still around, their lives are going to be... We're talking today about, like, do we move somewhere cooler? Like, like Austin's really freaking hot. Is it going to be unlivable in 20 years where you literally can't go outside in the summer and enjoy life? Should we move somewhere? Like that is a direct consequence of understanding more of the science that is in your book. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Although I will say about this like, what Jim Hansen, who's a scientist who I hope you can tell the book loves.
He's such a hero in this book.
Yeah,
totally.
incredible, right? And there are a number of nice organizational things that I could do because I spent so much time with the book. And Matt, we didn't inflict on the listeners just how hard a book it was to write. So
Please do
talk about some of the. But Hansen he's introduced as somebody who never curses, right? He has a gee whiz manner, but by the end, his last quote in the book, a great New Yorker writer named Elizabeth Colbert asks him, do you have any message for children growing up now? Do you have any messages for Matt Bucher's kids? And his message is, I'm sorry we're leaving such a fucking mess. So that the experience of living through the 50 years of non-action on climate is at least it taught... You could retitle this book, How Jim Hansen Learned to Curse. I don't. But one of the things that Hansen said, which is great, Matt, is it's not that warming will always cause warm summers. It's that it loads the dice in favor of warm summers. So if, let's say you had a dice, you had just normal 6-sided dice, 2 of them, you had a 1 in 12 chance normally that there'd be a really hot summer, or that you'd have a summer with more than 5 days in excess of 90 degrees. As you put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's not that you're guaranteed, but it's just that you now have 2 chances in 12. And then if you have another 5 or 10 years, you have 3 chances in 12. So the idea, I was reading one of the climate scientists who was saying that now our odds are 20% on any given day of having, or on any given summer of having a hotter than average type summer. So we have loaded the dice up from 1 in 12 to 1 in 5.
And we had this thing happen in February, which was the greatest ice storm we've ever had in Austin in February. And it destroyed a lot of 100, 200-year-old live oak trees because those trees had been so stressed by years of drought and heat. And it had this sort of effect where it wasn't so much there was tons of ice, which there was. They're usually built to withstand that. But because they had been stressed by, a decade plus of drought and extreme weather already, that it caused them to crack and break. And so we had something like and a city of Austin picked up branches that was like 100 times their annual pickup in terms of tonnage in one day. And it was just phenomenal. It took months to clean up all of the downed branches. And that wasn't because we had particularly hot year the year before or the year before that. It was a consequence of 10, 15 years, 20 years, 50 years of stress on the vegetation. And we see that with biodiversity in general. I think that we've lost a lot of animals, and, large land mammals have greatly, we see it in the fish and everything right now in the Gulf of Mexico.
Let me say that when talking about the book, it was such a thrill to get it to work the way I wanted it to work. But when I was taking a walk before the three of us sat down, I was thinking, Jesus Christ, we just warped this world to suit our aims. And where do we come off, right? Yes, it's the pleasure of having told the story in a way that readers like us could enjoy it, which I think could lead to useful political action. But yes, when you say things like that, if I'm not thinking about the book or just thinking about the problem, it's what a shocking, terrible outcome for this planet, which is everything is going pretty well, right? It's evolved in a certain direction. And then humans from about 1820, 1830 on developed the ability to change the environment to suit their tastes. And then everything else has to suffer. And even though I'm very loyal to my species, you have to root for your species team. It's like we are the worst luck that the planet has had, which makes me sad. For just the reasons that you were saying. Let me say one more thing about what you were talking about, which gets to the fun DeLillo part of telling the story. About 10 years ago, people tried to start in the same way that people tried to start the phrase going postal. I remember that Amy Heckerling wanted to start the phrase going postal, so she used it in Clueless. She had heard some kids trying to get it going, so I think she put it in the screenplay there. They tried to start global weirding because what they were saying is it will have consequences just like the ones that Matt was talking about. Mm-hmm. Like when you're heating things up in the summer, it will throw all of the weather off. And so the outcome of that is that the deniers, the people who design the politics for the deniers, they would say, see, when it's too cold, they're going to say that that's a result because they're just lying to you. And so a lot of our opinions,
Igloo, right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of our opinions are designed for this in a way that are disturbing. Like when I run into students of mine, we'll have family members or spouses who are still in denial. And so they will say, ask a professor about this. And so one of the questions that I got from a really brilliant writer, this is her husband, as if our class is a call-in show. Hi, go ahead. Go ahead, West Hollywood, California. What's your question? Go ahead, Les Milos. You're on the air. And his question is, if it's real, why did they change the phrase from global warming to climate change? And you guys remember why. There was a brilliant pollster named Frank Luntz, who the Times described him as Merlin for the Republican Party, just the wizard who can allow them to win their battles. And in 1998, he began working on a memo which became public knowledge in the first part of our century. So it tends to be thought of as 2002. What he said is, Republican candidates, editorial writers, it's time for us to stop using the phrase global warming and start using the phrase climate change, because global warming has catastrophic connotations attached to it. Whereas climate change sounds like you're going from Cincinnati to Fort Lauderdale. And so that's the degree to which our opinions... Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That what you find in before the word memes, our brains were memeplexes about things like this. So the reason that tobacco got involved in global warming denial is if you could make the EPA look like they were wrong about climate, then maybe the EPA was wrong about secondhand smoke. Right. And so the idea was just to, in a sort of Clockwork Orange way, just to get in there when you weren't looking and just peel back the top of the head and just fiddle with your opinions just a little bit.
And I noticed in the book, you stick with warming and saying warming a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that shorthand keeps the focus on that fact that there is warming. And climate change, I think, was adopted widely because seemed like a complex issue, right? And that we did want to say when El Nino was worse, and whenever X and Y happened, that was because of changing climate. Liberal politicians picked that up just as easy. But the focus of being on warming, it seems undeniable to the data, right? Like, if you focus on that piece of it, it seems hard to argue with all of the hockey stick charts, that say.
Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah. No. So Matt, the 7, just I think for the foreseeable future, the 7 warmest years in history will always be the 7 most recent years. Yeah. If you were born after February 1985, you've never known a cooler than average month.
Wow,
on
that's
the planet
crazy.
Ever. So the data, the data is the data, and it's what they warned us it would be a long time ago. This is the point in the conversation
where I'm going to ask Dave if he has any final questions, and then we're going to tell people where to find your book. And
you guys are such lightweights.
Well,
come on, 7 years on.
We have another segment for our Patreon subscribers that we're going to get to. So it's not the end. This is just a point in asking where Dave's questions.
Yeah, my final question was, how optimistic are you about humanity's ability to take real action on this issue? Governments take real action on this issue. Does the book, The Ministry for the Future, seem realistic to you? Because it's a science fiction book about a ministry that gets made in the future that is tasked with representing the unborn humans and animals this planet will have. And so it's a book about possible solutions to this problem. I recommend it. It's pretty phenomenal. And so I just, sort of to Matt's question, like how depressed do you feel as a result of doing this book? How optimistic do you think, how can we get out of this mess?
Okay. Yeah. How optimistic are you, Dave? Like you just read Robinson's book. And
it made me feel hopeful.
So how optimistic
it made me feel hopeful, Robinson's book, and I think I'm optimistic that like good scientists will prevail and like figure out ways to mitigate this problem, or and hopefully eventually, if not neutralize it, maybe gain some territory back. I feel like I have to be hopeful about this because I have kids, and so that's sort of to Matt was saying too, and I have young kids, right? So what does their future look like? And I have to believe that we will be able to claw this back somehow. But I think we have to overcome a really fundamental human aspect of human nature, which is just greed and capitalism seems to be the real thing that needs to be overcome here, because it seems to be
the guy who invented. Sorry, I got so excited by what you were saying. The guy the first person to understand that you could actually make mathematical calculations as to how much heat would come from doubling carbon dioxide. He's a man named Svante Arrhenius.
Yeah, right.
And just one thing for people who are tuning in late, I'm joking because cancer podcast. This was always an establishment idea. Like the scientist who first isolated carbon dioxide as the thing that helps us keep the sun's heat on the planet. Without that, by the way, we'd just be like Mars. We'd be very chilly. And so you couldn't have vegetation. You couldn't have either Dave's or Matt's kids. You just would have no life. The person who discovered that in 1859, John Tyndall, was an establishment scientist. He was about to become the director of the laboratories for the Royal Institution. Similarly, Svante Arrhenius, who did the first work where he said, if you double carbon dioxide, it will raise temperatures 4 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much proven solid. From 1896, he was the first Swedish recipient of the Nobel Prize, and he then went and directed the Nobel laboratories for the rest of his career. And by the 20s, the New York Times referred to him as the most distinguished. He was a chemist, is what he won the Nobel for, the most famous and the most distinguished chemist alive. So this was always an establishment idea. But Dave, what he said, he started out very optimistic. He was known for his optimism. By the 1920s, in his last book, which was Chemistry and Modern Life, It was like a Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of popularizing book. He deliberately wanted to scare readers. And he also said, it is clear that in the future, we must stop both national egotism and the profit-making industries from being allowed to make the decisions on the proper use of national resources for just the reason that you said, which is capital is they're the wrong people to make these choices. And to me, it's fascinating that the man who in 1896 understood how carbon was going to work to regulate climate, that, almost 30 years later, he was like, there's no solution. The current things can't solve this problem. And so we have lived out both of his discoveries over the last century. You guys may have noticed that my lightheartedness, because the story is a great story. It's the kind of book that I love to read.
Sure.
And Matt, you know my reading taste. But when you guys mentioned your kids, the lightness jumped away from my presentation. In general, if you're curious, from what I understand from people in government, they have the sense that this can be solved technologically, that it's a technological problem and there will be a technological solution. So the weird thing to me is, but you don't know what it is. So, for example, there was no technological solution to cancer, right? The tumorous growths that were caused by repeated exposure to nicotine-inflected tobacco smoke, the only solution was to stop using it. There never was a technological solution. So the thinking among the people who help us plan our national outcomes has been for some time that there will be a solution offered. Now, the Kim Stanley Robinson one of the sulfur dioxide being dumped out of the airplanes.
That's a short-term solution.
That's not, and
there's a lot of geopolitical
Yeah.
backlash the rest of the world against India when they decide to do that. But
But there have also been, Dave, there have also been scientists who think this may be a problem that's been faced by other civilizations that have gone from disorganization to high organization, and maybe they couldn't solve it either. It may be that there isn't a solution, like we're trapped inside an atmosphere, and maybe there's no solution. Matt, I don't know what about your and Dave's kids. That is such a difficult
I think
problem.
Dave's kids are a little younger than mine, and I was thinking like they have a chance of making it to the year 2100, which, as a kid, like me growing up, everyone was curious like what the year 2000 was going to be like, or like 2000. We just didn't even think much beyond the year 2000. It was just like, oh my God, 2000, like that's going to be
Y2K was
such a huge deal, like getting to the year 2000. And now like it's realistic that Dave's kids will be alive in another century beyond that, which is the year 2100. And so like a lot of these science fiction ideas, I guess, have started to seem a lot more realistic to me. And that, there's a chance like my kids are going to live a long time and be faced with unknown sort of horrors that are maybe, over generations, like slowly boiling the frog more. And it's not because of lack of technology. It does feel like a lot of it is lack of political will. And you tell this great story about the Obama's first term where, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, the White House, and there just wasn't enough political will to go around to do two things at once. And really,
how do you solve
it really wasn't enough to even really solve healthcare for us. And
I was
that's just the point. Is like a lot of the problems that we have in this world. I feel like this all the time with guns too. It's like it's just a lack of political will and a lack of people getting off of their phones to go actually vote. Voting is very low.
Yeah, I would also argue that that the modes of political persuasion became so sophisticated. There's a great phrase in nuclear power, and I think it probably in atomic weaponry too, which is going critical. It's when you get when your chain reaction actually becomes nuclear, right? I think that our tools of political persuasion went critical, let's say in the late 70s, early 80s, and they're so sophisticated that you can keep something. It's better to keep something as a political issue than to actually solve it. So warming, climate change, global weirding will be a voting issue for us for our whole lives. And then you can also use countering it as a voting issue for the Republicans. So I think it's not lack of political will. I think that our weaponry became so sophisticated that on most political issues, we just have a trench line. Like Dave, I don't know how World War I is taught in Canada, but in America, what you keep seeing is just those two trenches that are across from each other. And then there's like a no man's land, no person's land in the middle that's just all scarred, no trees, just like bodies that are mangled and they're stuck on fences.
I've spent a lot of time teaching World War I history in my teaching career. So
okay, great.
So
and so without the intercession of the fresh American troops, that war would have gone on forever. And I think that our politics became so sophisticated, sadly enough, around the time that we discovered this problem, that you could keep motivating people and you could keep the problem simmering without solving it indefinitely. Because you can always get people to come out and say, we can't afford this, we can't do it. Also, the other part that makes it slightly insoluble is our need for economic comfort. And Theda Skocpol, who is a great political scientist from Harvard, she quotes the head of the Pew Charitable Trust saying that no important environmental regulation has ever been passed during uncertain economic times.
I remember that.
And the way our economy is always going up and down, it seems to mitigate against there being a solution. So, Matt, what I was just talking about, it made me really sad when you were saying 5 years from now, because friends of mine who live in Arizona, they were saying that they can only go out for a few minutes a day.
Yeah, that's sort of where we're at right now in Austin with this summer. And, I think what you were saying about the ability for us to keep it as a political issue might actually have more value politically than to solve things. That is, very capitalistic in a lot of ways. That it's got this value to it as a bludgeon almost, that we can convince people to do things or not with this as an issue, and that if it were to be something that we were to get under control, how much would that actually benefit us in the way that politics work now is this mass communication phenomenon. Yeah. And, the country's only getting larger and the population. I think about these in very abstract ways sometimes of like, how do you just feed 7 billion people 3 meals a day? Like, that's an incredible task. And it's like, how do you get the temperature of the seas to go down 1.5 degrees? Like, that's an incredible task. Yeah.
But you're asking about that is a good, optimistic answer. I, by the way, think that I think this summer is the equivalent of the ozone hole. So I think all will be well. But do you guys, and it was interesting researching this, do you guys remember the phrase, Matt, I know you will, Dave, you may not, but the population bomb or the population explosion, the idea, if you go and you watch Soylent Green, which is a terrifying, great movie, the idea was that you couldn't feed 7 billion people. And that was true based on the food technology of the 50s and 60s. But a man named Norman Bourlier, I was afraid it would be a hole, but it's a shallow hole, so you won't spend that much time. He invented a kind of wheat. I always associate it with quadrotriticale, which is the wheat that we episode. But he invented essentially a short-stalked wheat that you could grow anywhere, because we would have had ruinous food shortages by the 80s, 90s, and 2000s all across the world if Norman Bourlier hadn't developed a wheat that grew more firmly.
And it was a technological solution.
So exactly. So the idea that we could do that suggests that there could be a technological solution. And also, for all the complaints people had about the mask mandates and our staying indoors for 2 years, as someone who'd been, as Matt knows, researching and writing about this for the better part of 7 or 8 years, what I saw was that Americans could act for the common good, and they could give up huge amounts. They could sacrifice to help solve a problem. And I think that if you said to Americans, look, you simply can't drive for a year or two, you'll have to take public transportation because we don't want to have a repeat of the summers of 2003 and 2004. I know Americans can do that, and Americans know they can do it too, because all they have to do is search back to their memories of 2000, 2021, when they kept their kids at home, and whenever they went outdoors, they were masked. We can sacrifice. So that was one of the thrilling things for me as someone who cares about this issue and had researched it pretty deeply, is that I saw Americans acting for the common good for really one of the
And
first
it was
times
staying
in all
home
our
was
life.
great for the environment. And like, yeah.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah.
So all I have to do is do it again. And, luckily we have the writer's strike now, but we've baked a huge amount of Netflix content of varying quality. But a terrible show can be fun to watch sometimes too.
Okay, I think we're going to transition here and take a break, and we will do some housekeeping at the end of the thing, and then we're going to do the bonus part, if you're okay with that.
Great.
So, David...
Lightweights.
Only 2.5 hours.
It's more like that problem we already mentioned of us having little kids and dinner to feed and all of that. So,
of course.
We could say this is part 1 of 327, and
Sure,
we'll come back next week. I'll be happy to do it again next week. We could go chapter 1 book club. So
I would do it. Yeah. There's a side note, by the way. Like, we're
We'll
not being
cut this
recorded
out,
right
yeah.
now, right, or whatever. But okay, yeah. But one of the things, like, the book is, Matt. I know I'm talking to you, Dave. You write. I know that you've written chapters, but Matt, I know, writes books. Like, once I knew where the book was going to end, and so it's designed around 2 things, which is, it turns out that the story was about Edison after all, which is the light bulbs. Yeah, the light bulbs are what we managed to ban. Not cars, not airplanes.
Pretty
not
fucking
fossil
poetic,
fuel,
right?
just light bulbs. They're so great. Yeah, and then the second thing is, if you go back and check, every section begins with 1956 and a mention of Roger Revelle saying, in 50 years, we're going to know if this is true. And then the last page, he said that we'll know because there'll be salt water on the streets of London and New York. And there on the last page, London is dry because they have the Seagate and the Thames. But water, salt water flows over Lower Manhattan
It's
and
incredible.
shorts out the Con Edison plant. It was such a beautiful thing designed around that. Just fun. And that's the pleasure if you spend the exact I can spend that much time. So
yeah.
the Sarpinsky gasket. So if you talk about David Wallace for more than 100.
Cool. Do you just want to do the final housekeeping little end of?
All right. So this has been great. We really appreciate you coming here.
Thank you, David.
My sincere apologies for not having you on before. I was thinking of David Markson's excuse of why he didn't write more books, which is simple barnyard laziness. And my excuse for not having you on partly was out of respect for your busy life and schedule. And I know you traveled a lot to write this book, and it took a lot out of you. And so I'm happy to have waited so long to have this moment with you where the book is done and we can talk to you about it. So so thanks for making the time for us today to talk. It's really been a joy and a thrill.
Yeah, what a huge pleasure to have you on, David, and thank you for this wonderful book. It's so dense and illuminating and entertaining and funny. The part about the Marlboro cigarettes, rebranding to becomes the cigarette with balls, and with the cowboy, there's just so many weird, funny, amazing things that you uncovered in this book. I just really want to thank you for it, and thank your publishers for sending it to us. It's been a great read over
Dave took it to Ireland, I think.
Thank you again. I did, yeah. I read most of it in Ireland. We just got back a week ago, and then finished the rest of it on the ferry to Vancouver.
So if our listeners want to keep up with David Lipsky, where should they follow you? Or, the book is available everywhere. We can't even say Twitter anymore. I don't even know if Twitter.
I have. I X, but I don't have a social media.
That's good.
So they'd have to follow
the Parrot and the
through,
Igloo.com.
They'd have to take your classes at New York University. Would be a good way to come in.
We have had one former student of yours on the show, which was Dario Diofebi. Dario.
I know how is Dario?
We love the book.
Great.
He came to our conference last year in Austin too, and he was a great guest. We loved having him on, and that's one thing that I knew I would love the book is that he had thanked you and Martina Testa so profusely in that book. Yeah. But just one of your many.
I was also delighted.
Students.
Yeah, I was also delighted. I recently read The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty and saw your name in the acknowledgments, and my eyes lit up. I was like, oh, this is such a cool connection. Yeah,
it's a total pleasure to teach people who love to read, and that's one of the great things for us to be talking. has been just three people who love books. And that's, again, the point of this book was to tell this story to people who their basic interface with the world is through a page with punctuation and letters on it. So I love talking with you guys about it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this.
Dave.
And Dave, any people want to email us, they can email us at concavityshow@gmail.com. We are on all the socials. Mostly Dave's more on Instagram these days. I think we're Concavity Show on Instagram, X, whatever. But what else, Dave, do we need to thank?
That's it, as usual. Thanks to our patrons. If you're a patron, stick around. We got more from David Lipsky coming at you soon here. His top 5
or some
books.
Kind of books.
We're not sure what that top 5 is going to look like, but we're looking forward to hearing it. Thanks. This has been episode 74. Until next time.
For the answers you seek.